All right, so get this. We've got excerpts from an article, and it dives into some pretty controversial stuff about the war in Ukraine, like things that former President Trump has said. And to make it even more interesting, President Zelensky is pushing back on some of it.
Yeah, it's a real clash of perspectives.
So let's jump right in. Trump called Zelensky a dictator without elections and even said that Zelensky better move fast or he is not going to have a country left. Pretty strong words, huh?
Yeah, definitely strong language, but to really understand that, we have to remember that Zelensky was democratically elected back in 2019, and he won by a lot, like 73% of the vote.
So the people definitely chose him.
They did, but the Ukrainian law says they can't have elections during martial law, and that's in effect right now because of the war. So Zelensky put them on hold for now, which some people don't like, but it's not totally new. Like even the UK and Canada extended their parliaments during World War I.
Interesting. It really makes you wonder, is it ever the right move to postpone elections when there's a war? I mean, is it to keep things stable, or could it be a way to hold on to power?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. There are arguments on both sides. I mean, on the one hand, having elections in the middle of a conflict could be really hard and even dangerous. You have to think about the safety of the voters and making sure the process is fair.
Yeah, and I bet it's hard for a country to be thinking about campaigns and policies when they're just trying to survive.
Exactly. But then again, putting off elections can make people worry about transparency and accountability. It's a balancing act between keeping things secure and sticking to democratic principles even when things are really tough. And that's something every country has to deal with during wartime.
For sure, and it's definitely adding fuel to the fire here. Okay, so next up, Trump said Zelensky's approval rating is just 4% and that he would lose in a landslide if they had an election. Now, what do you think about that?
Well, it's strange because no one knows where that 4% number came from, and the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology says Zelensky's trust rating is actually 57% as of February 2025.
Whoa, that is a huge difference.
Yeah, and it just goes to show how important it is to really look at the information we get, especially during a war. Numbers can be twisted pretty easily, and if you don't know where they came from or how they got them, it's hard to know if they're even true.
It makes you think maybe someone's trying to spin things a certain way.
Could be, and it's worth pointing out that even that 57% is lower than it was back in May 2022. Right after the invasion started, it was 90%. Then public opinion can change a lot in times like these, and those changes can tell you a lot about how people in a country are feeling.
Right. It's like a snapshot in time. You're only seeing one little piece of the story. Okay, so let's move on to something else that really surprised me. Trump kind of suggested that Ukraine is to blame for the war, saying they should have made a deal with Russia and that they shouldn't have started it.
Okay, now we really have to look at the history here. We can't forget that Russia already took Crimea back in 2014 after the Maidan Revolution when they got rid of a pro-Russia president, and that started the Donbas War with fighting between Ukraine and Russian-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine.
It's like trying to understand a movie, but you only watch the last 10 minutes. You're missing so much.
Exactly. And right before the big invasion in 2022, Zelensky was trying to talk things out even as Russian troops were building up on the border.
So saying that Ukraine is the only one responsible for the war is, well, it's really oversimplifying things. It ignores years and years of tension and aggression. And speaking of complicated things, let's talk about aid. Trump said that the U.S. has given way more money to Ukraine than Europe, like at least $200 billion more.
He said Europe gave about $100 billion and the U.S. gave, let's say, $300 billion plus. But if you look at the data from the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, it tells a slightly different story.
Oh, really? So what do the numbers actually say? Well,
according to the Kiel Institute, Europe has given about $132 billion, which is like $139 billion, and the U.S. has given around €114 or about $120 billion.
Okay, so not as big of a difference as what was being claimed.
Right, and there's actually something else we should talk about with all this aid stuff. There's a lot of debate about how much of the aid they promise has really made it to Ukraine. Like some of the U.S. money was supposed to be for getting more weapons and helping defense companies, not going straight to Ukraine.
That's an important point. It's not just about how much money they say they'll give. It's about how they actually get it there and how it gets used.
Exactly. And it makes you think, what do you think is the most important thing when we're talking about aid? Is it the total amount, the speed of delivery, or how they use it? It's a tough one.
Yeah, it adds another layer to the whole thing. It seems like every time we look closer, there's even more to think about. All right, let's switch gears for a minute. Trump said after those talks in Saudi Arabia that Russia wants to end the war and wants to stop the savage barbarianism.
Well, that sounds pretty good, right? But when you look a little closer, like at the intelligence from the U.S. and its allies, it seems like Putin still wants to take over all of Ukraine.
And hasn't Putin himself said that he doesn't think Ukraine is really a separate country and that Russians and Ukrainians are basically the same people?
Yeah, he has, and that says a lot about what he really wants. Plus, Russia is occupying a big chunk of Ukraine, like 1/5 of the country. So while they might be talking about peace, their actions say something different.
So is Russia really trying to make peace, or are they just trying to buy some time? Who knows? But it's a huge question, not just for Ukraine, but for the whole world.
Absolutely, and it's something we need to be careful about believing everything we hear, especially in a situation like this.
Okay, so today we looked at some pretty big claims about the war in Ukraine, and we found some problems with the numbers and different stories about who's to blame and if peace is really possible.
And what we really saw is that it's important to think critically, especially during a war. People can use information to try and get what they want. So we have to question everything, look at different sides, and watch out for biases.
It reminds us that we all need to be informed and really pay attention to the news, and sometimes that means going deeper than just the headlines and sound bites to see what's really happening.
I agree completely.
This has been a really interesting deep dive. Thanks so much for being here and sharing your knowledge. Hopefully this will make people want to keep learning more about this complicated situation.
You're welcome. And before we finish, I want to leave you with one last thought.
I'm all ears.
We've talked a lot about looking at the claims, but we should also think about why people are saying these things in the first place. What are they trying to do? Who benefits from these stories? Going around those questions go deeper than just checking facts and make us think about the real-world effects of misinformation.
That's a great point. It reminds us that this isn't just about abstract information. It's about real consequences that can change how people see things, what they believe, and even what they do.
Exactly. As the world gets more and more complicated, we all need to be careful about the information we get, think critically, and search for the truth even when it's hard.
Well said. Thanks again for joining us on this deep dive into the war in Ukraine. We hope you'll keep thinking about this important topic. And remember, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. It really is like peeling back the layers of an onion. Each new piece of information just reveals another layer of complexity.
You're right. It just makes it that much harder to see what's really going on.
For sure. And that's why it's so important to just keep questioning, keep digging, and keep an open mind.
Yeah, definitely. The situation in Ukraine is always changing.
Exactly. And our understanding of it needs to keep up.
It does.
So I think we've covered a lot of ground today. Any final thoughts you'd like to leave with our listener?
Just this, remember that information can be a really powerful tool and people can use it for different reasons. So we need to be aware of that. Be critical thinkers and try our best to separate fact from fiction.
Especially when it comes to something as serious as war.
Absolutely.
Couldn't agree more. Well, thanks again for joining us on this deep dive. I hope this gave everyone some new insights and maybe even inspired some further research on your own.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listener, thank you so much for sending in this fascinating collection of excerpts. We encourage you to keep those questions coming, keep thinking about these complex issues, and never stop learning.